This is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording on Wurundjeri land, and I'm joined today by my two co-hosts. Global Vice President for T-shirt dispatch and delivery at the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie, and what shiny new wares do you have for us on the merch stall this week?
Well, good evening, Luke and Tennant. I'm here, as I always am, on Gadigal country, scheming away for world domination, one T-shirt at a time. And it did occur to me on the actual pod last time we talked when listener Rob Law asked, why isn't sufficiency more of a thing in Australia? That it occurred to me that a sufficiency of sufficiency-themed T-shirts in this country actually must be at the very centre for why this isn't taking off.
Frankie, to misquote Billy Bragg, sufficiency is just a T-shirt away.
That's right. Well, it is now.
It is now.
So I think after that little rant, I started playing on Canva with some funky text, and wouldn't you know, I think you could expect to see a limited edition run on more Sufficiency Now T-shirts on the LMSU merch page. And my bold prediction is at least one of you will buy this, and it will have totally been worth it just for that.
Well, if nothing else, we amused ourselves. And I think we need to make it very clear that there is the standard Let Me Sum Up T-shirts, which are always available. This will only be available for the next, 3 or 4 weeks.
Sure.
So if you want one, you got to get in there and get one because they're going away.
That's right.
That's fast fashion, but with a sustainable twist.
And that voice is emerging from a man who by day is a mild-mannered climate policy analyst, but by night roams the Old West hawking CBAMs to unsuspecting townsfolk. It's old Doc Tennant himself, Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
As a result of being pursued by several angry posies of disgruntled developing countries who, for some reason, deny my old Doc Tennant's claims, I am currently eschewing that particular identity. But I wish it to be known that it's still the case that border adjustments for carbon can cure all ills, and we'll find out a little bit more about what they can do at the very end of this episode, I hope.
Okay, on this week's show, we are tripping the light taxonomic with Australia's shiny new sustainable finance taxonomy. But first, the Albanese government has announced a big new gas review, a blockbuster cross-portfolio event featuring both Energy and Climate Minister Chris Bowen and Resources Minister Madeleine King. The stated aim is to ensure Australia's long-term access to affordable gas alongside renewables, as well as keeping faith with trading partners that are expecting steady shipments of gas from Australia for many years to come. But this review will need to navigate many issues, amongst them tetchy trading partners that aren't thrilled by the parochial push to keep Aussie gas for Aussies, the increasingly contested role of gas in much of the Australian economy, and the ongoing effort to land an ambitious 2035 emissions reduction target and the associated sectoral decarbonisation plans. Tennant, the politics and the policy of this are both pretty complex, right?
Yes, they are, and adding to the complexity is the fact that this is just the latest stage in, at this point, a 20-year saga around gas exports and managing the domestic supply security implications of them. So it's worth just a little revision of that history. The review is of 3 ongoing interventions in the gas market or security measures that have been introduced over the years. The Australian Domestic Gas Security Mechanism, which is the export control powers that the government can break out of a glass box in an absolute emergency and use to block exports, even contracted exports, if they absolutely have to, if there is an imminent shortfall of domestic supply looming. They can use that. They don't want to use that, but it is there if they have to. They're reviewing the Mandatory Gas Code of Conduct, which is the big intervention that the current government did during the aftermath of the invasion of Ukraine, and when we had that winter in 2022 when a quarter of the coal fleet was out of action at once. Gas demand went high at the same time as the price was going to the moon internationally, and prices went to the moon here. The government capped prices, and then they introduced this mandatory code, which, among other things, said prices are capped for a significant amount of supply unless you get an exemption. And if you're a big producer with an export connection, the thing you've got to do to get an exemption is convince the government that you're going to supply a significant amount of gas domestically at a reasonable price. And then the third thing they're reviewing is the heads of agreement, which is the sort of voluntary compact between the government and the gas exporters over tipping some uncontracted gas voluntarily into the domestic market or swapping gas about, which was first introduced by the Turnbull government, who also started the ADGSM, but it was an unimplementable version of the ADGSM, largely to scare the companies into doing the heads of agreement. Now, we got here because when the three big East Coast LNG export projects around Gladstone were being considered back in the 2000s, the then governments, the Howard government and then the early Rudd government, they got some advice, as did the other energy ministers, on whether the opening up of the eastern market to gas exports might have some impact on the domestic supply security and prices. And the advice came back, oh, yes, adding export terminal would have some impact. And incuriously, all the governments went, oh, well, that sounds fine. We don't really need to know anything more. Well, three enormous ones are being proposed. Oh, well, that seems fine. Let's just have a regular environmental impact assessment process, which had a bit in it where economic information could be offered. But those processes were not really about the economic impact or the cumulative gas market impacts. That is largely, that bit of those reviews is largely just a place for projects to provide evidence that they're shit hot and so great for jobs that people should be unfussed about whatever local environmental impacts they might have. So there was nothing of a gas security nature in place.
And that's sort of the original sin here, right? Isn't
Yes.
it, Tennant? Because everything subsequent to that sort of that fork in the road is trying to retrofit some kind of framework, which is hard to do because it wasn't agreed up front.
Yeah.
That's right. Governments do not want to rip up contracts once they're made, especially not when they are with our bestest friends in the whole world or our biggest customers in the whole world, or both. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't a coincidence that there was no framework in place. People in the Howard government and the Rudd government thought that what was good for gas exports was good for the country, and they carried that view with them into post-politics jobs with the gas industry. One of the very first things I did after starting my current job in 2009 was field a call from advisors to the then resources minister trying to get industry to unite to defeat the Queensland government's rumblings about doing a domestic gas reservation at that time, because it would have been bad for the country, they thought. So we are where we are. They've been trying to everybody's been arguing about how to respond to this ever since. Retrospective stuff seemed a bridge too far to almost everybody until the recent election campaign, when a retrospective gas reservation, but just of uncontracted gas, was proposed by the opposition. And now the government's united all the scheduled reviews of these three elements of sort of not massively effective gas security policy and opened up the decision space to, well, maybe we could just evolve these a little. Maybe we could freeze them in aspic, or maybe we could do something rather more ambitious.
Could I ask, what might be a triggering question for the three of us. Where does the future gas strategy sit in and amongst all of this? Because
this review is very aligned with the future gas strategy, according to the media release that accompanies it.
Yikes. Okay.
But I think it's the right question, right? Because, that's why I called out the fact that Minister King and Minister Bowen are both sort of co-leading this review. It's obviously being prosecuted at the departmental level, but there has been the degree to which climate and energy policy and resources policy has been existing in two parallel universes.
Totally.
And this is a place where some of that comes together and will, I'm sure, prompt some pretty interesting questions, both between the ministers and also between the departments that have carriage of these strongly interacting policy issues, because there's been quite different views expressed from different parts of government about the role of gas moving forward. Not completely discordant, but certainly, if you were doing a vibe check from the Resources Minister and the Climate and Energy Minister, you'll get quite a different sense of the role of gas in Australia's economy and beyond moving forward.
And of course that disparity is very jarring and obvious to anyone who works in the climate field in particular. And I think why so many of us were just deeply unimpressed with the future gas strategy that was first released a couple of years ago, having very much been driven out of the resource minister's department and area. So it kind of strikes me that whilst, it would make, I guess, sense to pull all of those three things together for review, you're really not looking at the whole thing holistically, are you, if you're not having consideration to the potential use cases of gas into the future and what might be done, on the other side of that coin, and looking a little bit more strategically across the board rather than just the focus on the suppliers and the security of supply. That seems to me quite a narrow lens through which you could view this whole issue.
So there's two places, I think, where that broader set of concerns really becomes quite operative for this review. Because you could say, oh, well, look, yes, all those other issues are important. They all have their own processes, maybe. Certainly the sector plans will be quite important. And so, this is just about, what is it that's going to provide security to the domestic market in the context of exports being a thing and fears about domestic short supply. The bits where they really, really intersect are, well, how much domestic supply do you need? There's an option in the mix here for something that is effectively a forward-looking gas reservation. You could phrase that in different ways. A national interest assessment where the condition of approval is volumes of gas could be a thing here. More principles around volume-related commitments under the existing gas code could be a thing here. But what kind of volumes do we need? And if you're plugging in the current projections for demand for gas from the AEMO integrated system plan and gas forecasting, which we've gone through before, they're through no moral fault of AEMOs, they've got a fistful of asterisks on them before you can take them seriously.
Yeah.
One of the lesser-known Sergio Leone movies.
And for a few asterisks more, maybe we can get to the second bit of intersection, which is how much export is there going to be?
Yep.
Yeah.
Currently, the foundational export contracts for the East Coast export terminals all expire around 2035. And then what happens? Now, it could be that they all just recontract at more or less the same volumes that they're already exporting, in which case they need to produce a lot of gas, a boatload of gas, you might say. It is currently assumed in the ISP, in the gas market projections, it is assumed that their exports phase down from that point over a period of time because the world will be on a 1.5 degree-ish trajectory. We will see. Currently, I would guess that they will recontract. And so, what are the rules under which they're going to recontract? Are there going to be any rules on that? And the answer, one of the available answers out of the space of ideas in this paper is yes, they'll need to get a license to export new volumes, and there'll be conditions on that. And one of those conditions might be you've got to reserve X% or Y petajoules for local supply at a price we like.
Which of the options available is one of the safer ones from a sovereign risk perspective because it's prospective, right? It's not retrospective, and that seems like an obvious place for the government to go. I think, to your point, Frankie, there is an opportunity here as part of this review. While it's not strictly within the terms of reference, I think it's really important to think about both supply and demand, and particularly kind of what is a very muddy debate around gas where a lot of different issues are being conflated. We need to tease apart how low-value uses of gas should be phased out in the short term versus relatively high-value uses of gas like manufacturing feedstock and firming renewables is likely to have a role in the economy for some time to come. Those two things I think are quite poorly understood. And then there's this whole other debate which we saw blew up over the last 6 or 8 weeks with the Woodside decision, which is gas as an export. It's a massive contentious debate with strong feelings on all sides. If those debates are conflated, it gets very messy and we don't get very far. And if there was more clarity from the government about some of the things which are clear around where gas makes sense to use in the economy and where it doesn't make much sense to use it on an ongoing basis, I think that it would not just help plug in the right numbers in terms of what gas we actually need, it would just help sort of support more literacy in the public about the role of gas over the long term. And then on the exports, there is an understandable interest from the government in not breaking faith with export partners. And one of the things that gets said by the government is, we can't just pull the gas. These are long-term relationships, and actually we want to maintain those relationships. In recent episodes of this podcast, we've talked about the opportunity for collaborative decarbonisation. And so I get all that. And it's particularly relevant where our trading partners have existing long-lived gas infrastructure where there's significant capital tied up in it. That's got a life, and I think that if you're interested in an emissions reduction objective, you would hope that life is shorter rather than longer, but there's some sort of transition that you need to work through. I think where it gets a bit murkier is where we have trading partners that are currently investing in new gas infrastructure in 2025 or 2026 or 2027 or 2028. There's quite a lot of that happening in our region. This is in the context of august organisations like the IEA saying, we need to just stop investing in any new fossil fuel infrastructure. And so are we as a nation, does that get grandfathered in? Are we saying, as long as our trading partners are investing in gas infrastructure, we are committing to supply them in perpetuity? Or is there a point where we say, we'll support the economic kind of investments that have been made in your particular domestic context to a point, but there's going to be a point beyond where we're not signing up for that. And that's interesting in the context of that kind of regional decarbonisation conversation, because ideally we want to be supporting our partners to leapfrog this technology and maybe not get sucked into the rhetoric around transition fuel and this somehow being like a plausible bridge to net zero. There's something there which I don't think that's a binary. I think there's more nuance in there, and it's not currently being reflected in the debate.
There'll have to be, and as you're also pointing out there, we don't have the legislative or other framework to really be guiding these decisions and providing that certainty and insight, I think, to both our regional partners, but also domestically. So I think, you can have the terms of reference that you've got, but you're going to cop this feedback on the way through anyway. I would have thought a look back on if it's a revised future gas strategy or something, like it's just, I think actually there's a reasonably good amount of consensus amongst experts about what sort of highest value uses of gas will be into the future, but it's not, it's not really articulated anywhere from a Commonwealth government perspective. The cognitive dissonance that's really hard to then accept with that is that you have, other systems and processes like AEMO's ISP that program in a bunch of energy savings, electrification away from gas at the household level, like for which there is not policy in place to drive at the scale that, that those gains are assumed to happen over the next little while. So that definitely needs dealing with. And on the export piece, I'm certainly not an expert in this space, but I just think there's only so long we can, keep pointing at things like the EPBC not being the right tool for the job, existing legislative frameworks like the EPBC Act, which, is fundamentally not geared up to inform decisions about whether we should invest in new fossil fuel project infrastructure and things like large new gas development. So I just think as a country, and, the third largest exporter of fossil fuels in the world, there's only so long we can credibly point to the deficiencies in existing regulatory frameworks before we decide actually we need to do something about that, and provide some long-term signals to both our domestic market but also our international trading partners about the direction of travel, about the framework by which we're going to decide on whether we invest in and open up new fossil fuel resources, which, I'd argue are fundamentally incompatible with the kind of future we're all striving towards. So at some point we do need to tackle that issue, like whether this review is the, the thin end of the wedge on that. Maybe it won't be, but we do need to start thinking about that. And I think there's only so much time you can point and say, well, that's not what this process is designed to do. The disparities in how we talk about this have to be reckoned with at some point, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, I think the discourse that we have a chance to all participate in, if like around COP31, should Australia host that, around like really partnering with our regional trade customers on coordinating the phase up of their demand and our supply for clean economy goods and services, and phasing down supply and demand for high emissions goods and services. Like that is the most constructive, least politically disastrous place and way to really put that issue into a place where it can be dealt with, but isn't going to cause, I think, immense havoc and agita for communities or the government. If it's not that, then I think it is a bunch of horrible fights about stopping stuff that various domestic and international people are going to say, but we need it. We need it. I did have one more thought to check before we finish this section, which is to give some prominence to an idea from a friend of the podcast, sometime co-host of the podcast, Alison Reeve, that in my day job I've nicked, which is...
I think I tried to nick it and you were even more light-fingered than I was in it. Get in quick for bright ideas from A. Reeve.
The Artful Dodger works for AI Group. Which is that if there's going to be something resembling a domestic gas reservation, what about giving the obligated parties, i.e. gas producers or exporters, the option, as well as being able to meet that domestic reservation by supplying gas domestically, to meet it by paying for gas users in Australia to transition to something else? To be able to meet their obligation with negajoules as well as gigajoules. And my early hyper dodgy spreadsheeting of this suggests it could actually be a very financially attractive way for the gas businesses to go. It could be a lot cheaper for them to source negajoules than to do additional gas production. So if they could get over their ick factor at the idea of anybody ever not using gas, then they might grow to love it. It would be a weird turning on the head of the logic that a lot of other people have tried to get going of, well, if you do gas demand reduction, that frees up more gas for industry to consume. If you pay industry to stop using gas, it frees up more gas to export. But however people feel about that stuff, could be a clever way to get more enthusiasm and, importantly, more money that doesn't have to come from taxpayers or energy users to get electrification or efficiency or other, I don't think this is going to be very financially attractive to do biomethane or hydrogen, but for efficiency electrification, it could be pretty good.
Yeah, I think it's a super interesting idea, and it is worth properly kicking the tyres on it. I just wanted to close by saying I think that, I'm choosing to be optimistic about this review, and I think it is a positive thing that it's being co-led by the Resources Minister and the Energy and Climate Minister. I think, that cognitive dissonance was pretty clear in the previous term of government. And if this is a vehicle for bringing some of those conversations together across government, because these issues are only going to be resolved through really grappling with the different imperatives, which different parts of government, and let's be frank, those different parts of government represent different parts of the community.
Yeah.
Those conversations need to take place, and hopefully this is a genuine opportunity to start some conversations, probably not resolve all of them, but maybe get us to something which is closer to a coherent approach to gas in this nation. Shall we chat about a report?
We should.
A baffling financial instrument, I think you mean.
Sure, let's go with that. Last month, the Australian Sustainable Finance Institute released version 1 of the Australian Sustainable Finance Taxonomy, which provides a framework for assessing the sustainability of different types of economic activity. In partnership with the Federal Government's Treasury Department, ASFI undertook an extensive consultation process that sought to define the activities that could credibly be categorised as either green or transitional across 6 economic sectors. Of course, sustainability encompasses a lot of things, and V1 of the taxonomy is squarely focused on activities that are aligned with emissions reduction or elimination. However, other sustainability metrics are accounted for at a less granular level, and there is an aspiration to build on this work to expand the taxonomy to comprehensively address other issues like adaptation, biodiversity, and the circular economy. Frankie, in our day jobs, all of our organisations provided input into the development of this taxonomy in one way or another. How do you feel about where it landed?
I think this is a super interesting and positive development, but I think you can't think about or look at a taxonomy like this in isolation. You need to see it as part of a broader puzzle, if you like, and it's sort of one part of the government's broader sustainable finance roadmap. So I do want to dive into what the taxonomy is, but let's think about that in the context of some of the other things that government is doing. You can't divorce the existence of this from work that the government's done to implement climate-related financial disclosure requirements, which have just come into effect this year, putting obligations on some of the largest Australian companies and emitters to disclose their climate-related financial impacts, risks and opportunities. The government's not just doing that. They're also looking at work to provide guidance material on credible net zero transition planning. And I think all three of us have sort of looked further afield around the world at various initiatives, particularly in the UK. I've done some really great work on transition planning and sort of establish frameworks for large businesses and governments to look at there. Government's also going to be considering sustainable investment product labelling. They're issuing green bonds. I think the Australian AOFM issued the first Treasury green bond last year. So there's a lot going on. And the taxonomy, as you sort of said, Luke, it's this classification system, people call it a dictionary, if you like, that identifies those activities. It can be asset level investments, projects, facilities, technologies on their own that deliver against those objectives. And to be really clear, in this first V1, they have really narrowed in on climate change mitigation. There are other environmental objectives that are set out in the taxonomy as well. All 6 of them. I should have them up here. Yep. So we've got climate mitigation. There's also an objective on adaptation and resilience, biodiversity and ecosystem protection, sustainable use and protection of water resources, pollution, prevention and control, and transition to the circular economy. So all of those 6 objectives are there because I think they're trying to lay the groundwork and really clearly signal that this is stage 1, but this is going to be expanded into the future to cover all of those different sorts of things. And we know that there's crossover in there. So what the taxonomy does is that it creates that common language for investment in activities that are contributing to basically things that are aligned with a 1.5 degree net zero future. And it acknowledges that other activities may well have impacts on those other environmental objectives. So there are 2 other elements in this taxonomy apart from the technical screening criteria, which identifies criteria that projects need to meet to satisfy, that they're meeting that objective around a 1.5 degree future. There are also provisions around do no significant harm, that it's not going to adversely impact those other environmental objectives. And there are also another pillar around minimum social safeguards, and that looks at making sure that none of these activities or investments are undermining or adversely impacting human rights, First Nations rights and perspectives, and that you've got kind of corporate governance well and truly in line with good practice. So this thing aims to do a lot of different things, actually. As we said, it creates that common language for investment. If it's used correctly, it ought to help reduce greenwashing by having that government-backed, sort of common dictionary, if you like, for what is a green investment. And it also should strengthen investor confidence in the claims that are being made by project proponents, against this taxonomy. I would kind of caution, though, and I think I'm not actually sure how we all interacted with this too much in our day jobs, because I don't think we actually spoke about it much amongst ourselves. But I think we want to resist the thought that this is all things to all people, and it's certainly not a substitute for the kind of due diligence or traditional investment due diligence that companies need to do around financial risks and returns and things like that. It doesn't do that. It also doesn't tell investors what they can and cannot invest in.
And part of that limited scope is a strategic decision to make the task tractable, right? Because if they tried to create a taxonomy that covered these 6 various environmental objectives, the climate change mitigation, as well as adaptation and resilience and biodiversity and, protection of water resources and pollution control and that circular economy piece, there would never be a version 1 because you can't get to the end of that task. And so what they've chosen to do is say, well, what's the top of the pops? Mm-hmm. And they're quite explicit about this. Like, the focus of Australian policy making at the moment is on climate change mitigation. These are all important considerations, but this is, I guess, first amongst equals. And so they have gone sector by sector and gone through, well, what are the activities that sit within agriculture and land and minerals, mining and metals and manufacturing and industry and electricity generation and supply and construction and buildings and transport, 6 sectors which line up pretty nicely to the sector plans that are currently under development. And they've gone through quite detailed, as you say, technical screening criteria that kind of like categorise the activities that they feel can meet the criteria for either being green, which is aligned for a 1.5 degree pathway, or transitional, which effectively means, and they've got some language around this, but it's supporting that trajectory even if the activities themselves are not 100% aligned, but they deserve some level of recognition. And effectively, the do no significant harm on the other secondary environmental objectives and the minimum social safeguards is kind of like creating a safety net, saying we can't deal with all of this stuff, but we understand and acknowledge it's important. So we want to make sure that, any significant detrimental impacts on these other things that are also important are avoided ahead of us, having the opportunity to circle back to this and putting more robust criteria in place. I mean, this is a significant document, almost 200 pages just in and of itself, right? In terms of the level of detail and work is kind of remarkable. It's a very ambitious document. And I don't know, I reckon that as a first stab at this topic, I think that ASFI has a lot to be proud of. I think that it's pretty remarkable, really.
It's a huge body of work.
Yep. It also doesn't exist in isolation, right? The good folks at ASFI have been very open in also saying that even though Australia is an island, we're not when it comes to capital and finance. So, there are other taxonomies out there, I think sort of well known, and famously the EU taxonomy was one of the first to be developed. And so there's prior art that's been leveraged here as well. And I think very intentionally so, not seeking to reinvent the wheel. And that's actually a really key point here when it comes to considering the role of an Australian taxonomy. And whilst, maybe I would say, and obviously this is coming from a perspective of having been very deeply ingrained in the built environment and construction industry for a really long time, do I think this document tells people who are used to investing in Australian property what's green? No. There's a lot of people who already know. I'm just saying, people who are used to and au fait with sectors that have a long track record investing in that space. There are benchmarks and frameworks that have already existed in certain sectors. What I think is really good about the ASFI taxonomy is that it leverages those. It uses well-established benchmarks and proxies and incorporates it. And that's what is, not unique. It's a defining feature of an Australian taxonomy, because what it does is it aligns with international practice around, certainly seeking to align on the 1.5 degree science-based foundation of it. It's based on the IEA's net zero scenario, and they've even, because we've got very good modelling here in Australia through CSIRO and ClimateWorks, AusTimes, that's sort of the downscaled version of the IEA scenario. So they're all built on a kind of common foundation. But what it does do, what it should be very useful for, is that global capital perspective coming to Australia that perhaps is not so, up to speed or, embedded in local frameworks the way that we are here. So it gives them some commonality and a good kind of frame for how they can consider investing in Australian industry. And one thing I particularly wanted to note, and I think commend the ASFI crew for, was that I think you mentioned, Luke, they're obviously aligned with the 6 sectors that are the most significant contributors of emissions in the Australian context and economy. But actually the introduction of mining metals as a sector is novel and doesn't exist in other taxonomies, as well as the agriculture and land sector. That's actually new ground that ASFI's broken here. And I think for that reason will be closely watched internationally as well, to see whether that gains traction.
So I need to make a disclosure, which is that I was closely involved in this. In my personal capacity, I was on the Taxonomy Technical Expert Group, which heroically read through many documents and sat through many wonderful, meetings that were well run with wonderful people. But I have to say, those meetings, they almost always went through past 6 or 6:30 p.m. Because there were people to come in from London. It was a lot of work. And so I will have to be cautious in what I say or don't say around that work. But as for the outcome, it is indeed, it is a major piece of work. It is very much just version 1, and there are spots all through this where they note there is more work to be done. God help us all, on a lot of things, including the more elaborate technical criteria, screening criteria for some of the activities that are in here, where, say, on aluminium or iron and steel, there notably aren't strict numerical benchmarks for what emissions intensity should be expected of a green tick investment by particular dates, whereas there are those detailed schedules for other activities where the discourse was more mature and there was more ability to get to an agreed understanding with those industries themselves. So there's more to be done here. This is a highly technical working document for pointy-headed finance types to apply in a really important but limited context around the shaping of investment portfolios which specifically wish to be green for internal purposes or to underpin claims to others that they are green. And so I will just say I think we should be cautious about uncomplicatedly extending the use of this beyond that context. There's suggestions in the taxonomy and from the Treasury in sort of financing this work that maybe in the medium to long term this will be an input to policy making or regulatory solutions in some way. Like you could imagine grants programs or tax credits which you could only qualify for if you got a green tick in the taxonomy. As of now, you'd want to be pretty cautious before using it in that way.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why is that it has been devised in the context of a voluntary usage for those wanting a specific green tick. It's somewhat cautious in sticking to technologies and decarbonisation strategies that are really well established and understood now. It goes out, it's a little more forward-leaning on some things. It's got scope in there for in the animal agriculture section, and you can get a green tick under this for animal agriculture, which some people won't like. But one of the things, the options that is foreshadowed in there for earning that tick, it's not mandatory, is the use of methane-reducing feed supplements, which there is some work on, there is some data on. It's not well established in the commercial space yet. But on other things, it is more cautious. The other thing that I would say is we do need to think very carefully about the use of modelling. So there, as Frankie said, IEA work on the net zero emissions scenario, the 2023 version of that in particular, and then local climate works and CSIRO modelling work underpins a lot of the taxonomy. But of course, as good as those people are, as good as the work that they've done is, those are just like techno-economic models. They are not crystal balls. And just as we have thrown asterisks at like gas market modelling that gets taken from one set of limitations and then just used by governments as, well, this is what we're told is going to happen, and then by others is then used as, oh, this is what we're told government's going to make happen. There is a danger of taking a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy and not being able to recognise what the original thing was. And so if we were to say subsequently, well, things shouldn't be done because they're not in the taxonomy, and the taxonomy is saying, well, they shouldn't get a green tick because they don't show up in the modelling, and then you go back to the original modelers and they say, oh, we just didn't have a line in the spreadsheet for technology X because it wasn't a thing at that time. Well, we would want to be able to read the receipts there. And the place where this gets the messiest is electricity.
Oh, yeah. But before, because I do want to get into that. But before you do, I do just want to harp on that point you made around things that aren't in here. And just suggest that I think that's a super important point to make, right? Because some of the things that we spend time talking about on this pod, when we get, right in there in our comfort zones, looking at emerging technologies and things that are like the stuff that is actually, in some respects, the most in need of finance and investment to get onto a learning curve. Like some of that's not in here yet.
Yes.
Thinking about carbon removals, for example, so like that whole area ought to be a focus. You talked about food supplement for cows is in there, but just sort of more novel tech and approaches and things, across those parts of the economy we know are probably going to have to feature into the future, and like actually getting finance to scale those things up and get them to a point where they're commercialized and can be on that sweet learning curve. We just need to make sure that the absence of them in frameworks like this isn't a detractor when it comes to potential support and investment in scaling them up. There are other tools in the toolbox to bring on that kind of investment, but I think the risk is that they then are viewed unfavourably alongside other things that do appear here.
You're not in the taxonomy, therefore you're not sustainable.
No. The other, before we get into electricity, because I think there's some nice commentary to be had across the different sectors and things that appeared and how they were tackled. The other kind of more high-level point that's really worth noting, that's a little different, again, in the way that the Australian taxonomy evolved, was this idea of when we talk about the green technical screening criteria and transition, but there were also a category around decarbonisation measures. I thought it was really great to see those included, and that's sort of specifically an acknowledgement of, say, like a whole asset or project may not be capable of achieving the green certification, but but you do not want to deter or detract away from investment into activities that are going to help bring those projects or activities closer to a 1.5 degree future. You could, like, just to give an example, like the electrification of gas boilers in buildings, for example, is one of those activities. You know, a building with a gas-fired boiler in it, like a new one, not aligned, wouldn't get the green tick. But if you were seeking finance to do the electrification to get rid of that gas boiler, that, you know, that it is a thing that should achieve support. And I just think that's different again from the way the EU taxonomy sort of sets things out. It's very binary, green or not, and it doesn't provide, I think, as much nuance as the Australian taxonomy sought to introduce with that kind of thing. So I thought that was really good. As a feature.
Yeah, and that's one of the benefits of us coming in a little bit later and being able to learn from some of those early stabs at the similar task. I also quite liked some of the exploration around how the taxonomy could be utilised in different contexts, including in climate-related financial disclosures. They talk about these entity-level uses that you can use taxonomy as a bit of a reference point to describe the percentage of your revenue that comes from taxonomy aligned products or services, the percentage of your capital expenditure, the percentage of your operational expenditure, and because of some of the fact that this is a relatively nascent tool, I think that it would be hard to do a comprehensive assessment of the climate alignment of a large corporate entity's capital expenditure or operational expenditure. But as people get into the CRFD process, and specifically the transition planning process, which is really about getting down to that granular level about your decarbonisation pathway, your capital investment cycles, and your plans for making those investments, I can see this being quite a useful tool, particularly for organisations that are approaching this for the first time. Probably be a few years before you could rely on this as your handy-dandy guidebook for all the emissions reductions investments that you might be looking to make within your business. I can imagine it being kind of a useful reference point, and I'll be interested to hear from organisations that are, having a go at referencing the taxonomy in their own internal processes about how that goes. And I would hope and expect that is one of the pieces of input that would be being fed back into ASFI for version 1.1 or version 2 or whatever we can expect over coming months and years.
I think that's right. They're sort of very keen to emphasise that this is out there for voluntary use, and I'm sure they're hoping that this, initial period of it being out there in the world will be as much an indication of its both the degree to which it's understood and taken up, but also which sectors are using it more and like that. I think there'll be a huge amount of interesting insights that come through this first period, whether and where it's engaged with, what are the snags that people hit as they find they're engaging with those technical screening criteria, because there is just, I do have to tip the hat to the ASFI folks. The document covers a huge, broad and deep sort of ground here across the economy, and just a lot of different topics to wrap your head around. So it's certainly going to be the case that there'll be some teething problems across it, but they seem to have acknowledged that in getting it out there, and you do have to start somewhere.
Indeed.
So, electricity sector.
Electricity sector!
Well, we're clearly not done talking about the gas of it all tonight. No, we're not.
Yeah, so this has been one of the most contentious issues internationally as well, right?
Yes.
In terms of how you treat gas-powered generation specifically, and all kinds of barneys in the EU, I recall, a couple of years ago, over whether it qualified as something which was supporting the green transition or should be banished entirely.
Yes. And so the way that things have panned out in version 1 of the Australian taxonomy is that in terms of specific activities or assets that could be directly invested in or lent to, gas peakers do not qualify for a green tick or a transitional tick. The stuff that gets a tick is wind and solar and batteries and transmission lines, unless they're just to connect fossil assets, and pipelines for renewable gases or low emissions gases, as long as they're not locking in fossil facilities. As a sidebar, there's an exclusion in there for geothermal if it is enhanced geothermal involving fracking, which I think... there's nothing happening in Australia right now, but we'll just see if that turns out to be something that needs to be revisited in light of the whatever does or doesn't happen in the US. We might get to the US a little more in the bonus episode. But yes, the big exclusion here is gas peakers. And there are two, not one, but two appendices on this issue. And they bear reading. What is going on here is a couple of things. One is, of course, obviously a great deal of worry about the potential that high emissions assets could just all get a green or transitional tick because some of them are needed. Does any gas asset get a tick because some gas assets are needed? Is a thing that worries people. Also, the muddiness of the roles of gas is an issue that worries people. The sort of blurriness that happens when some people from the gas sector talk about gas as a transition fuel in the electricity sector, and maybe they mean small volumes of gas consumed for gas peakers to play a backup role for very large volumes of renewables. But maybe sometimes they mean large volumes of gas burnt to substitute for coal and never mind the renewables. So this is trying to avoid all of that. But also it's a problem with the nature of a taxonomy that is providing asset-by-asset guidance to what is fundamentally a systemic issue.
Yep.
And they've got some stuff in the first appendix on this that's about, the role of gas is very small in the modelling, and it's a bit larger in the ISP, but it's small in the modelling, and so it doesn't need to be in here.
It goes to, it isn't just the existence of the asset that is material. It is how, in this context, the asset is being used, which, to your point, if you're using a gas-powered generator to replace a whole lot of bulk energy that hitherto was provided by a coal generator, not that great, actually. If it's sitting there as a backup for the vast bulk of the time doing nothing, but kind of stepping in at critical moments to support your high penetration renewable energy system while we come up with exciting new zero carbon alternatives to play the same role in 15, 20, 25 years, actually pretty green, right?
Yeah.
And I think that it goes back to the conversation we had at the start of the show, which is that gas is just a big ball of kind of messy, muddy debates, and a lot of issues are getting conflated and complicated by us not having clarity about which bit of gas's role in the economy we're talking about at any given time. And so this makes these sorts of conversations quite difficult. But I also think I can understand how they arrived at it, because this is an understandably conservative document out of the gate, and they're effectively white labelling activities and saying this is definitely green.
Yeah.
And in some ways, you can't look at this initial version and say, well, if you're not in there, you're not green. You're just saying, well, you didn't make the cut. You're not white labelled. And so it'd be interesting to see how that topic is grappled with, because it does go, I mean, in a sense, there is an appreciation of the actual in-operation sustainability of particular activities or assets, in the sense that there is like expectations around emissions intensity that are built in to some of the activity classes. But somehow some of these assets that make a contribution to a system level emissions intensity, one needs to broaden the boundary in terms of the role that they're playing to actually get a proper sense of whether they are making that contribution to a 1.5 degree aligned pathway.
And this is where, it would just be better if policy could comprehensively deal with emissions in the electricity sector, and then clever people of goodwill in investment land would not need to tie themselves in knots trying to come up with actually applicable rules to substitute for that. Because if you just had a sector-wide emissions cap or price, you could just let traditional investment criteria guide the investment and operation of gas peakers.
Well, I think that's true, but I mean, I feel like whether gas generation is in the ASFI taxonomy or not is an entirely moot point for solving that particular issue. Like that generation is not going to be underwritten by green finance. There's going to be other mechanisms that come into play to make it financeable, right?
Well, yes, but it all needs money, and it does depend on what the status of this taxonomy on electricity in particular is seen to be in 1 or 2 or 3 years. We've got a policy process at the moment around reforming the national electricity market wholesale price mechanism, which is trying to navigate these issues with sort of guidance from the federal government, which is you can't put public money to new fossil assets, but it may well result in a mechanism that does effectively underwrite new gas peakers and a bunch of other stuff. And if people respond to that by saying, but those things aren't in the sustainable taxonomy, and 5 other things that they might say against that idea, then we don't actually have an electricity system plan that works without money coming from somewhere. And it's probably fine if it doesn't get a little halo around it, but it's sort of it's needed as far as we can see.
Yeah.
I think I've got maybe the worst and most offensive metaphor that I've ever deployed here. So get ready, Mark, to cut this out to save my future career.
Strap in.
But there's a chance that gas peakers here are the equivalent of Rhett Butler early in the running of Gone with the Wind, where nobody at the fancy pants Confederate gentry ball will give Rhett Butler the time of day because he's beneath them as an immoral, law-scoffing smuggler type. But it turns out they need it. Now, I think everything is wrong with that metaphor, but if you don't have a plan for greening the electricity system without this small volume, high impact gas peaker role, apart from the very real difficulties in mapping a system need onto individual assets in this construct of a taxonomy, but do you really need to make the needed asset feel bad about itself? which seems to be part of what's going on here.
Frankly, my dears, I don't give a damn.
About which bit? Which bit don't you give a damn about?
Fiddle-dee-dee, Francesca.
Fiddle-dee-dee is right. I just think this is the wrong document to be critiquing for a lack of certainty over the future of gas peakers. It was I think it's unreasonable to expect a taxonomy to provide that kind of signal to investors when the government responsible for regulating it isn't doing it effectively. So, my 2 cents for what it's worth is I think it's fine that it's not in here because if it's a necessary part of the system and ideally that would be identified in a government policy framework somewhere, that ought to be sufficient to drive investment over the time horizon that's necessary. I don't think it's a huge issue that it's not in here. And if I were the ASFI folks, I probably would have made the same judgment this time around. It could be something that you revisit down the track on the transitional side of things. But I don't think gas peakers need a green halo, especially because what you're trying to do is to filter investment in the infrastructure, not how it's used. So I think that sort of rules it out of contention at this stage, given where the policy kind of frameworks are at.
I agree. I just think the Nelson Review is far more consequential than ASFI taxonomy for the future of GPGs in our electricity system. I think Christy Graham is safe to continue ejecting the Rhett Butler of the Australia's energy system from her swanky party, at least for a little while yet.
I agree.
She can think about that tomorrow. After all, tomorrow is another day.
God, I love this for us so much. Can we do a very quick whip around of other things that we noticed in the taxonomy? I think nuclear's not in it, but who cares? I guess it's technically illegal. It's technically illegal anyway, so there's that.
Yes.
I thought what was really great, and this is another one of my hobby horses in the agricultural space where they talk about cropping. I thought it was really good that there were those kind of guardrails around energy cropping, and just that you couldn't green tick things where you're sort of competing with land that has a higher and best use. I thought that was really great. And I was happy to see it there, along with a bunch of other stuff, because that's sort of and I guess we're going to hopefully see more conversation along those lines when we get into more detailed policy thinking around low carbon fuels and, sort of substitutes for fossil gas across the board. But that was good to see. Quick shout out on the buildings and construction sector section. It's very detailed, and that's because hat tip to my buildings colleagues, friends across the country. We've got really good comprehensive frameworks and proxies to reference in this space, and it's sort of one of the reasons the sector leads on global ESG benchmarks, because we've been able to rely on actual performance data from assets over a long period of time. So it was really good to see that reflected in the taxonomy, calling up things like NABERS ratings and Green Star ratings and the role that our National Construction Code plays too. Obviously some work to do to refine it, but I think it's one of the more comprehensive sections in the taxonomy, and I think they are acknowledged on the way through that it was one that they could dive deeper into because of all of that prior art.
I will note that in the minerals piece of this, they have been quite detailed for the various minerals that they're covering, and very ambitious in the level of emissions reduction on mine and around mine that they're requiring over by 2030, most of the minerals covered, the mining emissions would need to be about half their 2025 typical level to qualify for the green tick. The one that's most interesting here, and I think the most ambitious, is the criteria for iron ore investment. Iron ore, obviously a huge, huge deal for Australia now and in the future. And most of the associated emissions are downstream in turning that iron ore into iron and then steel. And so they have criteria here that they are trying to encourage, provide further encouragement for investment to solve the challenge of using Australia's most common ores, relatively low-grade ores, in the direct reduction of iron processes that, whether using gas or hydrogen, are the leading low-carbon steel technologies at the moment. And beyond 2030, even if your ore is able to be used in a DRI process, you can't, beyond that point, get the green tick for new investment unless it is actually going to a direct reduction of iron process. This investment on its own, or these criteria on their own, they can't create the markets to enable that to happen. There's, like all the other stuff we've been speaking about a lot lately, remains very important there. But this is a helpful piece, I think, of ensuring that the investment interest is there and is quite discriminating to help make that green iron sector happen.
All right. I reckon we should call it there.
I only wanted to have a little call out on the minimum social safeguards criteria, and only just to say that I think it's got the right intention and they are good things to have in there. I mean, I think, and again, it's not ASFI's fault. I think it is very hard for anyone engaging in any kind of investment to satisfy themselves accurately that those criteria are being met. The classic recurring example we talk about is, where are all the polysilicon coming from that are in all the solar panels getting manufactured around the world using forced labour from the Uyghur region in China. And it's very hard to distinguish between products that do have that in their supply chain and ones that don't. And so it's just it's a wicked problem, and I think it's good and right to be highlighting these things. And I think if nothing else, it's adding to the need to try and get more transparency on product provenance, and and I think like this also starts to wind up in more diplomatic areas as well, because some of these, I think, problems are not intractable, just well beyond an individual investor's capacity to influence. So it does require broader initiatives and nation states working together. That's all I wanted to say.
A sufficiency of social safeguards.
I don't want my sufficiency agenda bound up in that one. Thank you, Mr. Reid.
As always, we close out the show with one more thing in which we all share something that is currently captivating our attention. Tennant, what have you got?
I've got a thing about CBAM.
Shocked.
Yes,
Shocking.
It's the first time ever. We've been talking...
Hang on, you need to put on the voice.
Oh, yeah. Where's old...
No.
Where's Herr Dr. Tennant?
This may be the most popular thing we've ever done on the podcast, and you're denying
100%.
our audience the voice.
I want people to focus on just one thing.
Hang on. We will focus on that, but for those of you, and there are one or two of you that don't actually get around to listening to the end of the podcast, there is a very special intervention at the end of last fortnight's episode of Let Me Sum Up.
That is true.
And much of the banter that has suffused this episode will make much more sense once you've heard it.
Yes. Yes, it's one of those times when listening to 2.5 minutes of sheer insanity will make other things make sense.
All right. What very reasonable CBAM content have you got?
The European Union is charting new territory in carbon border adjustment mechanism land because they're finally coming around to a point of view that I expressed 4 years ago, which is that they're going to need to do an export adjustment, not just an import adjustment. The European Commission put out a paper recently on a bunch of initiatives to strengthen their green industry transition. And one of those is that they're signalling the development of an export adjustment or rebate. So this is not just imposing the European carbon price on imports to Europe of steel and aluminium and so on, but rebating some portion of European carbon costs to exports of those products. Now, exactly how much it will be, yet to be determined. Some people will look at that and go, my God, that's a subsidy for pollution. Others will look at it and say that is WTO illegal. Neither of those things needs to be the case, but it looked previously like Europe would be too worried about both of those things to do it. But European industry has been saying, my God, you can't leave us just naked in international markets. And so they're going to do something. And that'll be interesting in its own right. And it may be as a precedent or a don't do what Europe don't does example for Australia. Should we consider further implementation options for a CBAM of our own?
Okay. Very exciting.
I'm excited.
As am I, Tenant. I'm excited that you're excited. Frankie, what have you got?
Apart from secondary excitement at Tenant's excitement, I've got...
Sure, let's go with that.
I have the quickest of quick PSAs on a report that I haven't read yet, but it's on my to-read list. Ooh. And I think, lobbying that we cover it on this here pod at some point. Just last week, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation released a really interesting looking report. I think they worked with Deloitte on it. And it's got a great name. I got to find what it was called. Refined Ambitions, Exploring Australia's...
Love a good pun.
I love a good pun. That may be why it made it to the top of my to-read list. Good job, CFC. Exploring Australia's low-carbon liquid fuel potential. It looks like a really comprehensive look at the economic opportunity at like SAF, so sustainable aviation fuel, renewable diesel, synthetic e-fuels, also looking at stuff that comes from biogenic sources. And, the headline kind of claims are that it could deliver a bunch of money, 36 billion out to 2050 and a decent amount of carbon abatement. So this is just sort of one of those topics where we haven't actually had a huge deep dive on, despite it sort of pretty commonly now referencing that stuff needs to happen in that space. So I'm just interested to have a look at it, and maybe we'll talk about it, the three of us, sometime in the next little while. But it necessary work. So I'm glad the good folks at CFC have done it.
All right, watch this space. For my one more thing, I am going to give a shout out to the little mechanism that could, the wholesale demand response mechanism. There's been a bit of a rearguard action, which I describe as unhelpful, to say, well, we don't need the wholesale demand response mechanism. We've got all these fancy new mechanisms, two-sided market stuff that's going to do basically the same thing. Well, the AMC has been looking into it, and they have found for the low price of between $350,000 and $500,000 per year in operating costs, it has generated $4.32 million in dispatch efficiency benefits. So, kind of sounds pretty good. But not only that, lower wholesale prices, $219.3 million in lower wholesale prices, which I reckon is pretty good, particularly when it would be the position of the organisation that I work for, that actually there's a lot of things you could do to make it work a lot better. I won't go into the baselining methodologies and their shortcomings, but there are opportunities to make the WDRM even betterer than it already is, which suggests to me that it's worth keeping around. I think that we are not at the point in the transition where we should be removing tools from the toolbox. Anyway, WDRM. I see, Tenant, I've got my own four-letter acronym. Take that.
Well, now you need to record a loving paean to the WDRM.
Jesus.
I can report that will not be at the end of this episode. But I'll take that suggestion on notice. So it is almost the end of this here episode, but every fortnight after we finish recording the main episode, we lounge back on the Banana Lounge and just, take a sip of something special and chat about something we didn't get to on the main show for our fortnightly subscriber-only bonus content. There is too much. And really, Tenant, I think we can say there was only one thing that we could possibly turn our attention to this fortnight.
One big, beautiful thing.
Indeed. Tell us all about it.
So for the fun, special bonus relaxation time, we're going to be talking about the horrifying hellscape that has become US climate policy thanks to passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, possibly the most stupidly named piece of legislation in US history, although there is strong competition. And what was in it in the end? What's it going to do and stop doing? And what happens next? Well, you won't know unless you are a super Summerupperer.
And of course, you can head on over to www.letmesumup.net. Click on the support LMSU button at the top of the page. You'll find our Patreon. You can sign up there. You can also sign up in Apple Podcasts, which will give you the bonus episodes, but not all the added fun and frivolity that our friends on the Patreon have access to. But you'll get There Is Too Much. So if that's better for you, then you should go and do that. And yes, we'll try and keep it light-hearted somehow. As we trudge through the hellscape.
I don't like our chances, guys. I'm going to need some harder liquor for that, potentially. Yeah.
All right. That is our show for today. This podcast was edited by Energy Professional and Podcast Tragic, Mark Spencer from Here Media Studio. Frankie, it occurs to me that while we described the new T-shirts, we whetted people's appetites for the new T-shirts. I think we neglected to tell people how to get the new T-shirts at the start of the episode.
Very important information.
So maybe you could do that bit of cleaning up for us.
An exercise for the alert listener.
If you've just been freaking out this whole hour and a bit whilst listening to us crap on about taxonomies and Gone with the Wind analogies, you can rest easy. All you have to do is go to your web browser of choice or flip open your smartphone and go to letmesumup.net and click the shiny button on the top that says merch. And that's going to take you to our Das T-Shirt Automat storefront where you can find the limited edition shiny More Sufficiency Now T-shirt plus all of our regular delicious merch offering, including T-shirts, mugs, totes, all the things. Get onto it.
And of course, sufficiency for a limited time
That's
only.
Right.
These stocks can't last.
It's just so bad, it's good.
Yes, indeed. For Frankie Muskovich and Tennant Reid, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Ripped from the pages of the best-selling Taxonomy, they said couldn't be filmed. The timeless tale of love, war, and credible transition in the old NEM. Gas with the Wind, coming to your portfolio this July.
Daddy, who's that man smiling at us from the appendices? The nasty dog.
Why, Kate, it's Scarlet O'Super. Don't you know? Oscar Speaker from Gladstone. He has the most terrible reputation.
The romance that firmed a generation.
I generate for profit, and for profit only.
But don't you believe in the energy transition?
I believe in Gas Peaker. He's the only cause I've ever known. And I won't firm you today, though you need to be firmed, and often, by someone who knows how.
The epic tale of the triumph of sustainable investment, subject to minimum social safeguards.
As Oz Times is my witness, they're not going to firm me. I'm going to live through this transition if I have to lie, steal, cheat, or kill. And when it's all over, as Oz Times is my witness, I'll never burn gas again. Or not more than 5% of annual energy anyway.
You won't believe the raw passion of these screening criteria. Run, don't walk to your Superfund's next showing of Gas with the Wind.